The events leading to the first murder in human history are recorded in the book of Genesis chapter 4. At this point, humanity consisted only of the earliest family, descendants of Adam and Eve, living in a world still adjusting to life outside Eden. As adults, Cain and his younger brother Abel took on different roles that reflected their lifestyles and perhaps their perspectives. Cain became a farmer, working the ground and producing crops, while Abel became a shepherd, tending to flocks and raising livestock. These occupations were not merely economic choices. They shaped how each man interacted with the world and ultimately how they approached God. In time, both brothers brought offerings. This act suggests that even at this early stage, there was already an established understanding that God was to be worshipped through sacrifice or presentation. Cain brought an offering from the fruits of the ground, something he had cultivated through effort and labor. Abel, on the other hand, brought the firstborn of his flock, including the fat portions, which in later biblical tradition would be considered the best and most valuable part. According to the account in the book of Genesis, God accepted Abel and his offering, but did not accept Cain and his offering. The text does not provide a detailed explanation for this difference, and this has led to centuries of interpretation. Some suggest it was the quality of the offering, others point to the attitude or intention behind it. Regardless of the reason, the impact on Cain was immediate and significant. Cain became very angry and his expression changed. This reaction reveals the beginning of an internal conflict. His anger was not directed outward at first. It was something that developed within him. It is at this point that God intervened, not with punishment but with a warning. God asked Cain why he was angry and why his face had fallen. Then he gave a statement that would become one of the earliest descriptions of human moral struggle. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Genesis 4 verses 6 to 7. This warning is critical because it shows that Cain was given a choice. He was not immediately condemned for his feelings. Instead, he was instructed to master them. Sin is described almost as a living force, something external yet waiting for an opportunity to take control. Despite this direct warning, Cain did not change his response. Instead of correcting his actions or seeking understanding, he turned his attention to his brother. At some point after the offering, Cain spoke to Abel and invited him into the field. The setting is significant, away from others in a place where there would be no interruption and no witnesses. What followed is described briefly but carries enormous weight. Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. With this act, human history crossed a new boundary. Disobedience had already entered the world through Adam and Eve, but this was the first act of violence between humans, the first time one life was deliberately taken by another. The simplicity of the description emphasizes the gravity of the act. There are no details about the method, no extended dialogue, only the fact that it happened. The focus is not on how the murder occurred, but on its meaning and consequence. After the act, God approached Cain again with a question, "Where is your brother Abel?" This question was not asked out of ignorance, but as an opportunity for Cain to respond. His answer, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" reveals a shift in his character. It shows denial, deflection, and a refusal to take responsibility. God's response makes it clear that the act could not be hidden. "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Genesis 4 verse 10. In this statement, that is portrayed as a witness, and Abel's blood becomes a symbol of injustice that demands acknowledgement. This moment marks the full transition of Cain from a man struggling with internal conflict to one who has acted on it with irreversible consequences. The first murder was not the result of sudden impulse alone, but of unaddressed anger, ignored warning, and a failure to master destructive emotions. What follows next is not immediate death or execution as might be expected. Instead, Cain is about to receive a punishment that is far more complex, one that will shape the rest of his life. Following the murder of Abel, the response from God toward Cain was immediate, but it was also unexpected. In many ancient contexts, the taking of a life demanded a life in return. However, the account in the book of Genesis presents a different outcome, one that combines judgment with restraint. God began by declaring a curse directly connected to Cain's actions. They, which had received Abel's blood, would no longer cooperate with Cain. As a man whose identity and survival were tied to farming, this was a significant consequence. The ground he once worked would resist him. His labor would no longer produce results in the same way. This was not just a physical punishment, it was a disruption of his purpose and livelihood. In addition to this, Cain was sentenced to a life of movement. He would become a restless wanderer on the earth. This condition implied instability, displacement, and a lack of belonging. In the ancient world, identity was often tied to land, family, and continuity. To be cut off from these was to exist in a state of ongoing uncertainty. Cain's response to this judgment reveals a shift in his awareness. For the first time, he expressed concern, not over what he had done but over the consequences he would face. He said, "My punishment is more than I can bear." He went on to describe a future in which he would be driven away from the land and from the presence of God, forced to wander, and vulnerable to being killed by others. This statement introduces a significant question within the narrative. Cain feared that, "Whoever finds me will kill me." At this early stage in human history, the existence of other people is not fully detailed in the text. Some interpretations suggest that these could be other descendants of Adam and Eve, as the biblical account often summarizes generations rather than listing every individual. Regardless of the explanation, Cain clearly believed that he was not alone and that danger existed beyond his immediate surroundings. In response to this fear, God took an additional step, one that adds complexity to Cain's punishment. Instead of allowing vengeance to take its course, God placed a form of protection on Cain. According to the book of Genesis, God declared that anyone who killed Cain would suffer vengeance 7 times over. To reinforce this, he placed a mark on Cain, intended to prevent others from killing him. The exact nature of this mark is not described in the text, and it has been the subject of extensive interpretation throughout history. What is clear, however, is its function. It served as both a sign and a deterrent. Cain, the first murderer, was not to be killed. He was to live. This decision is significant. It demonstrates that the consequence for Cain was not immediate destruction, but prolonged existence under the weight of his actions. He would continue to live, but under altered conditions, cut off from stability, marked by his past, and carrying the awareness of what he had done. The phrase "driven from the presence of God" also carries important meaning. While God remains aware of Cain and continues to interact with him, this statement suggests a relational separation. Cain's life after this point would no longer reflect the same closeness or access that earlier generations experienced. By the end of this judgment, several key elements define Cain's new reality. He is cursed in relation to the ground, disconnected from his previous way of life, condemned to wandering, marked for protection, and separated in a deeper sense from God's presence. These elements combine to form a punishment that is not only physical but psychological and spiritual. Cain's story does not end with judgment, it transitions into exile. What exactly was the mark placed on Cain? Was it visible, symbolic, or something else entirely? And why would God choose to protect the first murderer instead of allowing justice to take its course? These questions lead into one of the most debated aspects of Cain's story. One of the most mysterious elements in the story of Cain is the mark placed upon him after his judgment. The account in the book of Genesis provides very little detail, yet this single act has generated centuries of debate, interpretation, and speculation. After Cain expressed fear that others would kill him, God responded not by removing the punishment, but by limiting the consequences. He declared that anyone who killed Cain would suffer vengeance 7 times over. This statement alone established a form of divine protection, but it was reinforced by something more tangible, a mark. The text simply states that God placed a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. However, it does not describe the appearance, form, or exact nature of this mark. This absence of detail is significant, because it shifts the focus away from what the mark looked like and toward what it represented. At its core, the mark functioned as a sign of protection. In a world where retaliation could have been immediate, Cain was set apart in a way that prevented others from taking his life. This introduces a complex tension within the narrative. Cain had committed the first act of murder, yet he was not handed over to human vengeance. Instead, his life was preserved. This raises an important question. Why would God choose to protect Cain? One possible explanation is that the mark was intended to prevent an early cycle of violence. If Cain had been killed in response to Abel's death, it could have established a pattern of revenge that would escalate rapidly among early humanity. By intervening, God limited that possibility and retained authority over judgment. Another perspective is that the mark ensured Cain would live long enough to experience the full weight of his punishment. Death would have ended his suffering, but continued life meant ongoing awareness, displacement, and consequence. In this sense, the protection was not necessarily an act of comfort, but a way of sustaining the judgment. There is also a symbolic dimension to consider. The mark distinguished Cain from others. It identified him as someone who had crossed a boundary that could not be undone. At the same time, it communicated that his life was under divine authority. No one else had the right to decide his fate. Throughout history, interpretations of the mark of Cain have varied widely. Some have imagined it as a physical sign placed on his body, something immediately visible to others. Others have suggested it may have been a condition, a reputation, or even a form of divine presence that acted as a warning. The biblical text itself remains intentionally brief, offering no confirmation of these theories. What remains clear is that the mark served a dual purpose. It was both a consequence and a protection. It ensured that Cain would carry the identity of his actions while also preventing others from ending his life. This duality reflects a broader theme within the narrative of the book of Genesis, the coexistence of judgment and restraint. Cain was punished but not destroyed. He was set apart but not abandoned entirely. From this point forward, Cain's existence would be defined by this mark. Wherever he went, he carried not only the memory of what he had done, but also a visible or known sign that set him apart from others. It was a constant reminder that his life had been altered permanently. The story now moves beyond the moment of judgment into the reality of exile. Cain leaves behind everything familiar and enters a new phase of his life, one shaped by distance, uncertainty, and survival. Where did Cain go after being driven away? What kind of life could a marked and exiled man build for himself? The next phase of his story begins outside the boundaries of everything he once knew. After receiving his judgment and the mark of protection, Cain entered a new phase of his life, one defined by separation and movement. The book of Genesis records this transition with a brief but significant statement. Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. This movement east of Eden is both geographical and symbolic. In the early chapters of Genesis, moving east often represents increasing distance from the place where God's presence was most directly experienced. Eden itself had already been lost by Adam and Eve. Now Cain moves even further away, extending that separation into the next generation. The destination is described as the land of Nod. The name Nod is commonly associated with the idea of wandering or restlessness. This aligns with the judgment pronounced on Cain, that he would live as a restless wanderer on the earth. Rather than a place of settlement or stability, Nod represents a condition of existence. It reflects a life without rootedness, where movement replaces belonging. Despite this, the narrative shows that Cain's life did not end in complete isolation. The text states that he lived in the land of Nod, which implies continued existence, interaction, and adaptation. While he had been driven from a closer relationship with God, he was still part of the developing human world. This raises an important question about the nature of Cain's exile. Being sent away from the presence of the Lord does not necessarily mean total separation from God's awareness or authority. Instead, it suggests a loss of direct relationship or closeness. Cain's life would now be lived at a distance, spiritually, emotionally, and physically, from what had once been available. The psychological dimension of this exile is also significant. Cain carried with him the memory of his actions, the reality of his curse, and the visible or known mark that set him apart. Living in Nod would not simply be about survival. It would involve navigating identity, fear, and the consequences of his past. Every movement, every encounter would take place under the shadow of what he had done. At the same time, Cain's continued existence demonstrates a capacity for adaptation. Exile did not result in immediate collapse. Instead, it forced a transition. He had to find a way to live outside the structure and familiarity he once knew. This shift marks the beginning of a broader human pattern, life beyond Eden, shaped by effort, struggle, and distance from original harmony. The phrase east of Eden, therefore, becomes more than a direction. It represents a stage in human development where separation from God and from the original state of creation becomes more pronounced. In Cain's case, this separation is intensified by his personal actions, making his experience both representative and unique. As the narrative continues, an unexpected development occurs. The man who was condemned to wander does not remain in constant movement. Instead, he begins to establish something more permanent. This development introduces a new dimension to Cain's story, one that shifts from exile to construction, from wandering to settlement. If Cain was meant to be a restless wanderer, how did he come to settle? And more importantly, who was he living among? These questions lead into one of the most debated aspects of his story. One of the most puzzling elements in the story of Cain appears in his own words following the judgment pronounced on him. After being told that he would become a restless wanderer, Cain responds with a concern that introduces a major question within the narrative. He says, "Whoever finds me will kill me." This statement, recorded in the book of Genesis, raises an immediate issue. Who exactly was Cain afraid of? At this point in the biblical account, only a limited number of individuals have been explicitly mentioned, primarily Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. Abel is now dead, and Cain is speaking as though there are other people already present, capable of finding and killing him. This has led to one of the most frequently discussed questions in early biblical interpretation. One explanation is that the narrative in the book of Genesis is selective rather than exhaustive. It focuses on key individuals and events without listing every person who existed at the time. Later in the text, it is stated that Adam and Eve had other sons and daughters. This suggests that by the time of Abel's death, there may have already been a growing population consisting of extended family members. In this view, Cain's fear is directed toward other human beings, relatives who might seek revenge for Abel's death. Another perspective considers the possibility that Cain's fear reflects a broader awareness of vulnerability rather than a specific group of people. Having committed the first act of murder, Cain may have projected the same capacity for violence onto others. In other words, his fear could have been shaped not only by external threats, but also by his own actions. He now understood what a human being was capable of, and that knowledge changed how he viewed the world. There have also been more speculative interpretations throughout history, suggesting the presence of other groups or beings not directly mentioned in the immediate narrative. However, these ideas go beyond the explicit text and are not confirmed within the book of Genesis itself. The most widely accepted explanation remains that Cain was referring to other descendants of the first human family. Regardless of the interpretation, Cain's statement reveals an important psychological shift. Before the murder, his struggle was internal, centered on anger, rejection, and emotion. After the murder, his focus turns outward. He becomes concerned with survival, threat, and consequence. The world is no longer just a place of labor and effort. It is now a place of potential danger. This fear is directly addressed by God, who responds by placing a protective measure on Cain. By declaring that anyone who kills him would face severe vengeance, God establishes a boundary that limits human retaliation. The mark placed on Cain reinforces this protection, ensuring that his life would not be taken prematurely. The presence of this protection does not remove Cain's fear entirely, but it changes the conditions under which he lives. He is no longer only a wanderer. He is a marked individual moving through a world where others exist, where relationships are possible, and where tension between justice and restraint is already developing. This moment in the narrative highlights the early emergence of human society. Even in its simplest form, it involves questions of justice, revenge, responsibility, and coexistence. Cain's fear reflects these developing dynamics and signals that humanity is no longer isolated, it is expanding. As the story progresses, another unexpected development occurs. Despite being sentenced to a life of wandering, Cain begins to establish something more permanent. He forms connections, builds a family, and eventually initiates one of the earliest recorded acts of human civilization. How does a marked wanderer become a builder? And what kind of society can emerge from a man carrying the weight of the first murder? The next phase of Cain's story shifts from fear to construction. Despite the judgment pronounced on Cain, that he would be a restless wanderer, the narrative in the book of Genesis presents an unexpected development. Cain does not remain in a state of endless movement. Instead, he begins to establish stability, form relationships, and participate in what can be described as the early stages of human civilization. The text records that Cain had a wife and that she bore him a son named Enoch. The presence of a wife again raises questions similar to those discussed earlier regarding population and family structure. While the details are not fully outlined, the broader context of Genesis suggests that human population was increasing through the descendants of Adam and Eve. Cain's life, therefore, was not one of complete isolation, but one that included relationships and the continuation of a family line. What follows is one of the most significant transitions in Cain's story. The man who had been condemned to wander begins to build. According to the book of Genesis, Cain built a city and named it after his son Enoch. This act represents the first recorded instance of city building in the biblical narrative. The construction of a city carries important implications. A city is not simply a physical structure. It represents organization, cooperation, and long-term settlement. It suggests that Cain's life had moved from instability toward a form of permanence. This appears, at first, to stand in contrast to the earlier judgment that he would be a wanderer. There are several ways to understand this development. One interpretation is that the term wanderer reflects not constant physical movement, but a condition of unrest and displacement. Even if Cain settled in one location, the internal and relational consequences of his actions remained. The city, therefore, may have provided external stability without resolving the deeper aspects of his punishment. Another perspective is that Cain's actions demonstrate human adaptability. Even under conditions of judgment, he was able to organize, build, and create structure. This reflects a broader pattern in human history, the ability to develop systems and societies even in environments shaped by limitation and consequence. Naming the city after his son Enoch is also significant. It indicates a focus on legacy and continuity. Rather than being defined solely by his past, Cain appears to invest in the future, establishing a lineage that would continue beyond him. This suggests a shift from survival to influence. However, this development also introduces a deeper layer to the narrative. The first city in the biblical account is not built by a figure of moral clarity, but by the first murderer. This creates a tension between progress and origin. Civilization, in this context, emerges alongside human failure rather than after its resolution. Cain's role as a builder does not erase his past. Instead, it shows that human advancement can occur even in the presence of unresolved moral consequences. The structures he created may have provided order and community, but they were built by someone marked by judgment and separation. As the narrative continues, attention shifts from Cain himself to his descendants. Through them, the long-term effects of his actions begin to unfold. Patterns of behavior, attitudes, and values start to develop across generations, raising questions about how much of Cain's legacy extends beyond his own life. What kind of legacy did Cain leave behind? Did his actions influence the generations that followed? The next chapter explores the development of his lineage and the increasing presence of violence within it. As the narrative in the book of Genesis continues, the focus shifts from Cain himself to the generations that came after him. This transition is important because it allows the reader to observe how the consequences of his actions may have extended beyond his own life and into his lineage. The descendants of Cain are presented as contributors to early human development. The text mentions individuals associated with key aspects of culture and society. Among them are those linked to livestock management, musical expression, and metalworking. These developments suggest that Cain's line played a role in the advancement of human skills and organized living. In this sense, the legacy of Cain includes not only moral failure, but also cultural and technological progress. However, alongside this development, another pattern begins to emerge, one that reflects an escalation of violence. This is most clearly seen in the figure of Lamech, a descendant of Cain whose recorded words provide insight into the moral direction of this lineage. Lamech is introduced as a man who openly speaks about killing another person. In a statement addressed to his wives, he declares that he has killed a man for wounding him and a young man for injuring him. He then makes a comparison to Cain, stating that if Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech would be avenged 77 times. This declaration is significant for several reasons. First, it reflects a shift in attitude toward violence. While Cain's act was followed by fear and concern over consequences, Lamech's words suggest confidence and even pride. Violence is no longer presented as a tragic failure, but as something that can be justified and amplified. Second, the reference to Cain indicates that his story had become a point of comparison within his own lineage. The protection granted to Cain, intended to limit retaliation, appears to be reinterpreted by Lamech as a basis for increasing it. Instead of restraint, Lamech expresses the expectation of greater vengeance. This shift highlights a key development in the narrative, the normalization and expansion of violence across generations. What began as a single act between 2 brothers evolves into a broader pattern within a family line. The moral boundary that was once crossed becomes less distinct over time. At the same time, it is important to recognize that the biblical text does not suggest that all of humanity followed this path exclusively. While Cain's descendants are associated with both cultural advancement and increasing violence, another line is introduced through Seth, the son born to Adam and Eve after the death of Abel. This line is described as one in which people began to call on the name of the Lord, suggesting a different spiritual direction. The contrast between these 2 lines, Cain's and Seth's, creates a broader framework for understanding early human history within the book of Genesis. One line is associated with development accompanied by increasing moral complexity and violence, while the other is associated with a renewed focus on relationship with God. In this context, Cain's legacy can be seen as multifaceted. It includes innovation, growth, and the formation of early society, but it is also connected to the spread and intensification of violence. The narrative does not present this legacy in simple terms. Instead, it reflects the complexity of human development in a world already affected by sin. As the account moves forward, the focus begins to shift away from the details of Cain's descendants and toward the broader condition of humanity as a whole. The patterns observed within his lineage begin to appear on a larger scale, eventually leading to events that will affect the entire human population. What does Cain ultimately represent in the story of humanity? Is he only the first murderer, or does his life carry a deeper meaning? The final chapter brings together the elements of his story and examines his lasting significance. The story of Cain does not conclude with a dramatic ending or a final recorded event. Instead, it fades from the narrative of the book of Genesis as the focus shifts toward the broader development of humanity. Yet despite this, Cain's life leaves a lasting imprint, one that extends far beyond the brief account in which he appears. Cain is remembered first as the individual responsible for the earliest act of human violence, the killing of his brother Abel. This act marks a turning point in the biblical narrative, where sin moves from disobedience against God as seen in Adam and Eve, to direct harm between human beings. It introduces a new dimension to human behavior, one in which internal conflict results in irreversible external consequences. However, Cain's significance is not limited to this single act. His story also highlights the complexity of judgment. He was cursed, removed from his previous way of life, and set apart by a mark that identified him permanently. Yet at the same time he was protected. His life was preserved, and he continued to exist, build, and establish a lineage. This combination of punishment and preservation creates a tension that runs throughout his narrative. In this sense, Cain represents more than a historical figure within the text. He becomes a symbol of the human condition after Eden, marked by failure, yet still capable of continuation. His life reflects the reality that actions have consequences, but those consequences do not always result in immediate destruction. Instead, they can unfold over time, shaping identity, relationships, and legacy. The development of Cain's descendants further reinforces this idea. From his line came individuals associated with early cultural advancements, including aspects of livelihood, art, and technology. At the same time, the emergence of figures such as Lamech illustrates how patterns of violence can persist and intensify across generations. This dual legacy, progress alongside moral decline, mirrors broader themes in human history. Cain's story also raises enduring questions about justice and mercy. Why was he allowed to live? Why was he protected from retaliation? The text does not provide direct answers, but it presents a framework in which divine authority governs both judgment and restraint. Cain's life unfolds under that authority, suggesting that his continued existence served a purpose within the larger narrative. Another key aspect of Cain's story is separation. He is described as having gone out from the presence of God and living east of Eden. This movement represents increasing distance, not only from a physical place but from a state of relationship. In this way, Cain's life illustrates what it means to exist beyond the immediate closeness that characterized the earliest moments of human history. At the same time, his ability to build, form a family, and establish a city demonstrates that life continues even in that state of separation. Human beings adapt, create, and organize, even when their circumstances are shaped by loss and consequence. Cain becomes one of the earliest examples of this reality. Ultimately, the story of Cain is not presented as a complete biography, but as a foundational account. It introduces themes that will continue to develop throughout the rest of the biblical narrative: the spread of sin, the complexity of justice, the persistence of human creativity, and the tension between judgment and mercy. Cain is not only the first murderer. He is also the first marked man, the first exile, and the first builder of a city. His life stands at the intersection of beginnings, of violence, of consequence, and of civilization. And in that sense, his story is not only about the past. It is about what humanity became after Eden.